Now, we should get feedback, though, from everybody to let us know if it's good to go. You may have to even refresh your page there, Dave. Okay. That's okay. Yeah, so I think I'm going to give it a couple of minutes just to make sure as we build an audience, as people come in. No, it'll be fine when you scroll down. Okay. So, Shabbat Shalom, welcome. It's lovely to be here. I wanted to say that you'll notice a few things different. First of all, if you found us, you're doing something different this morning. What's different about today than any other day is the question. And what we've elected to do is use Facebook. And we're going to call this a test for today's class. And if things work well, then we may make the shift. And I wanted to take a couple of minutes to describe to you the thinking process that put us here. For those of you who don't know, Facebook, according to a new article that just came out in New York Times Magazine this last week, said that more than 2 million people use Facebook every week. And 2 billion. Did I say million? 2 billion. And of those, 1.2 billion believed to use Facebook every day. So what we have is we have a large and growing number of people. If you know the population of the world is roughly 8 billion, let's say. So that's a quarter of the population of the planet is using Facebook. So when we started talking about what do we use for a platform, because we've grown a little bit unhappy with the results on YouTube and some of the other things, we decided let's look at our other options. The negative side, when you do your pros and cons, the negative side of using Facebook is that not everyone's on Facebook, right? 3/4 of the world's population are not on Facebook. You could say that. But the beauty of this is that once we finish with the teachings, whatever we post on Facebook, we can download that video and embed it on the website, and a person who doesn't want to be on Facebook or isn't on Facebook can go and watch the video themselves. So that's what's nice about it. So hopefully we haven't lost anyone by this. Hopefully what we've done is we've gained a larger audience, or at least gain the potential for a larger audience. And I like to say, Dave and Sherry and I, who've been here working on this for the past decade, and now we have John and Lyndon and Christine and other people who join us in the building, we've never really set out to say, how many showed up today? Like the old Sunday school board that I grew up with. That's never been the thing. But I want to say this, if we believe that we have some insight into the direction of Scripture for living a more authentically biblical lifestyle, then our goal ought to be able to reach more people. So that is my disclaimer for shifting to Facebook. And hopefully it works for us in terms of quality. And I'm not coordinated enough to keep up with the chat while I speak, but I wanted to be a little bit more informal rather than standing behind a podium and preaching so much, and sort of bring it more in the terms of a teaching. And so this is all a test. It's a test. So let me know. Give me some feedback. Today, we are moving forward in the book of Genesis. We're following according to the ancient triennial cycle of readings. And this ancient triennial cycle of readings is, we are in the patriarchal narrative, so we're still in the life of Abraham, and we're using the Transparent English Bible, which is the translation that James Tabor is producing. And so we are currently in Genesis chapter 21. But before I get into Genesis chapter 21, which is about the birth of Isaac, the promised seed, it's like everybody can breathe deeply. We finally have the promised seed. Before I get into that specific story, I want to go back and I want to pick up some of those passages along the way in the early chapters of Genesis, which bring us to this point. And then, towards the end of the class, I'm going to entertain a different view, a view that's put forward in Christianity by who is known as the Apostle Paul. And I want to contrast some things. So I understand that there are people who come in who are Jewish, who are Christian. I want to cover things as best I can from the text, and some of what follows might be challenging to some of the listeners today. But be patient with me as I tell people my opinion is one opinion, and others will have other opinions, and we'll discuss those kind of things. So what we're talking about in the life of Abraham, formerly Avram, we know that Avram was from Ur of the Chaldees, a place beyond the Euphrates. And I like to start off with this, even in today's class. If you'll go with me to the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 24, and I just want to read verse 2. In Joshua 24, verse 2, Joshua, by the way, he's gathered all the tribes at Shechem, and he's giving an address, and he's going back, he's looking back, and this is what he says. Verse 2, and Joshua said to all the people, thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, your fathers lived of old, beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. Now, this got me in trouble one time, because when I read they, and by the way, the Hebrew reflects the same plurality, when I read they, and we're talking about Avram and Nahor and Abraham, it says they were idolaters. Now, there are all these legends about Avram, and he's the one in Ur who's not an idolater and so forth, and he shatters the idols in his father's idol shop and so forth and so on. Biblically, we don't get that story. So from a biblical perspective, I like to think that he at least comes from a region and from a family who are idolaters, which to me is great, because it tells us that we all begin our journey from a place that is not perfect and holy. In our journey to find the true and living God, in our journey to find true faith, we often have to make our journey as a beginning point from idolatry. So when I think about that, I love that Avram, as he was formerly known, was in idolatry, because I know John was. That's where he started, at least. Maybe not the rest of us, but all of us, right? We begin our journey that way, and I think it's important to think about that. And Avram became known as a Hebrew. So in Genesis chapter 14, verse 13, for instance, he's called a Hebrew. Someone came to tell Avram the Hebrew. Now, this word Hebrew, Ivri, it basically means to cross over. So imagine if you're the guy who used to live over there and you crossed over, everyone in Avram's new location begins to call him, he's the guy that used to be on the other side. And I also like to think about our personal faith in that way. We've all made the journey. We've all begun, at least, to cross over. So that's kind of the idea that I like to think about. So from the initial call, we're going to build up today to the long-awaited promised seed, Isaac. But along the way, there are some passages that I want to pick up on. So, for instance, from the very beginning in Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, 12, 1 through 3, we get that call from God to Avram, where he tells him in Hebrew, Lech lecha, walk for yourself. Walk for yourself. Go from everything that's familiar to you. Leave your father's house, your place of origin, your family, everything that you hold dear, and go to a place that I'll show you. Again, Abraham or Avram at the time becomes a model for those of us who have left everything that we're familiar with in order to go to a place that we don't even know where we're going. I mean, think about that. When I was a young boy and I loved my Bible and I studied my Bible and I participated as a young man in church organizations, I never really envisioned that one day I would be sitting in a group of people like we did this weekend, reading and discussing the Hebrew Bible and even learning Hebrew and keeping Hebraic feasts and festivals from the Hebrew Bible. I could not have envisioned that. It wasn't even something that I thought about. And yet, this is what's so amazing about the call of Avram. He's called to go to a place, and he's not given details about that place. I think all of us can relate in some way. But he's promised two things from the very outset. He's promised land, and he's promised progeny, seed and land. So the thing about the land that's so essential is that this is a physical place. You can go there now. In fact, I go there several times a year now. But you can go to this place, and the land is for a very specific purpose. The land is meant to be a possession of the promised people. Promised people, promised land. Together, they bring about not only redemption for themselves, but redemption ultimately for the world. Because the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who've been given this land, are given this land to be a model of excellence for the world around them. So that ultimately all nations will look towards this one place, this model of excellence, this model of righteousness and justice in a sea of turmoil, and say, that's the way. We ought to live like that. So that's the goal. The two go together. But again, it's a land that when Avram set out, he didn't even know. He didn't even know where he was going. I want you to look with me, Genesis chapter 13. Genesis 13 and verse 14. So in chapter 13, verse 14, it says the following, Jehovah said unto Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see I will give to you and to your descendants forever. How long is forever? In Hebrew it's ad olam. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if you can count the dust of the earth, your descendants also can be counted. Arise, walk the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So this idea is that the seed, the promised seed that God continues to point towards, is not a future coming Messiah, if you will, but it represents a multitude. In what he calls in Genesis 12, a goy gadol, a great nation. So it's not a singular seed, although today we're going to focus on the promised seed, which is Isaac. But ultimately, when he talks to Abraham about his descendants, he uses this over and over. Look at the multitude. It's going to be like the dust of the earth. Or if you look at chapter 15, let's look at chapter 15 of Genesis, beginning in verse 1. After these things, the word of Jehovah came to Avram in a vision. Fear not, Avram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Avram said, O Adonai Jehovah, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Damasek Eliezer of Damascus. And Avram said, Behold, you've given me no seed, and a slave born in my house will be my heir. And behold, the word of Jehovah came to him, This man shall not be your heir. Your own son will be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you're able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And then it says this, And he believed Jehovah, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. This particular passage, he says, to God. Basically, you're making these promises, but I still go childless. The only way in Avram's mind that he can bring about the fulfillment of these predictions, these promises, is to appoint Eliezer of Damascus to take over. And God tells him, no, come outside, look at the stars. So we have dust of the earth, stars of the heavens. You can count neither one, so ultimately the promised seed is going to be multitudes, right? And then in verse 6, this passage becomes very, very important because what Avram does is he trusts. He has confidence, is what the Hebrew literally means. He has confidence that although he has no seed now, that God will ultimately bring about this fulfillment of this great promise, and he will indeed have seed numbering like the stars of the heavens. But time goes on. Excuse me. Still no seed. And Sarah decides, based on the text, to help things go along. All right? So one of the things that happens is Sarah has an Egyptian handmaid by the name of Hagar. She's an Egyptian. And Sarah, who is feeling this, think about it, when they left Haran, Avram is 75 years old. So you talk about your biological clock ticking, right? So how many of us, I have 6 children and 6 grandchildren soon to be. I don't know that at 75 I want to get the news that I'm going to have a child. I don't know. Maybe I'll be okay. I love children. But I'm not sure that I want to get that message. But Sarah decides, in order to bring honor and so that she might have children, she gives seed. She gives her handmaid to Abram in the event that she might bear seed through her handmaid. But as you know, that story doesn't turn out so well. In chapter 16, verse 2, Sarah said to Avram, "Behold now, Jehovah has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my maid, and it may be that I shall obtain children by her." Right? So her idea, and it says, by the way, the next part, and Avram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. So he goes along with the plan. After 10 years, they've been in the land for 10 years, Avram, through his woman's handmaid, will finally have a son. And the story could go from there, we would think. But it's so interesting in these patriarchal narratives that just directly under the surface, there's always a story within a story. That's why I love the Bible. And even though I've read these stories, I'm always looking for insights into the thoughts and so forth of these people who make up our stories. Problems arise, as you know. Hagar does conceive, and then she gets a little attitude, if you can go with me here, according to the story. According to the story, she begins to look at Sarai in a different way. Now, it doesn't say what she said to Sarai. It doesn't give a lot other than basically just to say, verse 4 of chapter 16, he went into Hagar and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. So she begins to, it's almost like the impression you get, it's like, I am pregnant. And it causes problems in the house, as you can imagine. So Sarai goes to Avram, and basically she says, this woman can't stay. And so what has to happen now is Avram doesn't want to step in, and he tells her, you deal with her the way you want to deal with her. It's in your hands. Sarai deals harshly with Hagar, and she flees. Now, I pointed out when I covered Genesis chapter 16, the thing that happened in that story is that because the two go together, chapter 16, chapter 21, we have to get the full story. But one of the things that I pointed out is just as Sarai deals harshly with Hagar and Hagar flees, those same verbs are used later in a story when the children of Israel dealt harshly with Israel. When the children of Egypt dealt harshly with the children of Israel. And I pointed out that it's almost like the lives of the patriarchs replay themselves in the lives of the descendants. So it kind of gives you a caution. You ought to say, well, God, I hope that doesn't happen with my kids. You ever hear people tell their kids, well, I hope you have, I remember hearing that, I hope you have one just like you. And I did, right? So be careful what you say. But Hagar does flee, and she's met by the Malak in the wilderness. And the Malak advises her to go back to Sarai and to submit herself, I think is the way the King James puts it. But in Hebrew, it's anah, to humble yourself, to make yourself low. By the way, this week, the Torah reading in the annual cycle of readings is Achrei Mot, which deals with the two goats that are associated with Yom Kippur. And what's the single thing that is descriptive of this Yom Kippur? It's this idea of humbling, making yourself low. So the Malak tells her, go back and submit yourself. Make yourself low, and you're not going to be here. You go back. And she does. But the Malak also promises that the child will produce many. We're talking about Hagar's child. She's pregnant. That he'll produce many, and he'll also be a great nation because it says Yehovah has listened to your humbleness, your affliction. So one of the things that I like to point out when I read this story, I don't like when commentators or anyone paints Hagar to be the bad one and Sarai to be the good one. So we have a good girls versus bad girls kind of thing. I don't like that for a lot of reasons. One, I don't think Scripture wants us to see that. So here's an indicator. If Hagar is just this bad woman who needed to be chased off into the wilderness, do we think that the Malak would come and save her? The messenger Yehovah, as the Hebrew calls it, shows up and saves her and tells her, go back. Now, the Malak is going to appear again later on in the story. But we don't hear, from this point, we don't hear anything further about Hagar until chapter 21, which is today's class. We do have a couple of references to Ishmael, because what begins to happen in chapter 17 is that Yehovah appears again to Avram, and in verse 5, we have this story where he changes his name. Yehovah comes to Avram and he says, no longer will your name be called Avram, but Avraham will be your name. He tells him, you'll become a father of nations. Kings will come from you. And then he gives him this covenant of circumcision. He also, in this particular story in chapter 17, changes Sarai's name to Sarah. So there is something going on in chapter 17. Now, notice, just to get ready to come into our promised seed, in verse 17 of 17, notice this. Abraham fell on his face and laughed because he's just been told it's through Sarah that you're going to bear a seed. See, Abraham wants to say, use Ishmael. Let's just get the plan going. Let's use Ishmael. And God says, no, it's through Sarah. And he just falls out laughing. In Genesis 17, Avram fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who's 90 years old, bear a child? And he asked, can you just let Ishmael be the guy? Let him be the son. So he laughs. And by the way, as most of you know, that is the meaning of the name of Isaac. All right? So look at verse 18. Genesis 17. Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight. And God said, No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son. You shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him and as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I've heard you. Behold, I will bless him and make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. He will be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But here's the point. I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year. So the covenant will be with Sarah's son Isaac. Chapter 18, we have another visit. I want to pick this up as a way of introducing before we get into. If you look at verse 9 of chapter 18, these three visitors, you can read this on your own. I'll give you the storyline. These three visitors. One, it says, And Jehovah appeared to Avram in the heat of the day, and he lifted up his eyes, and Shalosha Nashim, behold, 3 mortals. But yet, this is Jehovah appearing. In some way, he appears to Avram, and in this particular passage in verse 9, it says, Where is Sarah your wife? Now she's standing in the tent of the door. Abraham, verse 11, and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. A lot of people think in terms of a miraculous birth in the Bible, but they don't think about this story. They think of something other. Here's a miracle for you. This woman is 99 years old. She's already gone through the season. She cannot. She's dried up. He's 100. And yet, she's told, you'll bear a child. So verse 12, Sarah laughed within herself. Once again, we have everybody's laughing except God. He even goes on to say, is anything too hard for God, right? Don't assume that a miracle can't happen. Here it is right here. So all the things are set in place to bring in the child of promise. And we're going to pick up things in Genesis chapter 21. So in my notes, I just want to let you know that when I think of Abraham's 2 children, the 2 prominent ones, I'll tell you more about that later, but the 2 prominent ones in the early chapters of Genesis, they're basically called listen and laugh. Think about it. Ishmael means God hears. He hears. Listen, Shema, and laugh. Isaac, he laughs. So listen and laughter. If we think about the modern political situation and everything that goes on in the world today, Abraham's children have forgot to listen and forgot to laugh. So quite possibly there's a message in the story of these 2 sons. So I want to begin today, after I've done my introduction, by reading chapter 21. Now, you can use any translation that you have. I'll be reading from the Transparent English Bible, and it's very literal. Again, the idea, if you're new with us, the idea is that it's very much a transparent. That's why we call it that, right? That's why James called it that. It's like if you were looking at the Hebrew and it was written on a transparency, you could see the English underneath it. Very literal. Here we go. And Jehovah singled out Sarah as he said, and Jehovah did to Sarah as he had spoken. And Sarah became pregnant, and she brought forth a son to Abraham to his old age, at the appointed time of which Elohim had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son, the one being brought forth to him, whom Sarah brought forth for him, Isaac. And Abraham trimmed back Isaac his son, that's the literal translation of circumcision, trimmed back Isaac his son, a son of 8 days, as Elohim charged him. And Abraham was a son of 100 years at the bringing forth of Isaac to him. And Sarah said, Elohim has made laughter for me. Everyone hearing laughs for me. And she said, Who has uttered to Abraham, Sarah is making sons suck, for I have brought forth a son for his old age. again, very literal. The idea is that she's nursing a child at 99. Can you imagine? And everyone says no. And the one brought forth got large, and he was weaned, and Abraham made a large drink fest on the day of weaning Isaac. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had brought forth to Abraham, laughing. And she said to Abraham, drive out this house servant and her son. For the son of this house servant will not possess with my son, with Isaac. And the thing was bad exceedingly in the eyes of Abraham over the matter of his son. Just let that sink in for a minute. Very, very bad. I mean, I can't imagine as a father, first of all, having two women. That's beyond the scope of what I could possibly imagine. But if I did, and one of them said, your firstborn son, send him off. See, we read these stories, and I think a lot of times we try to clean them up. This is powerful. I mean, to me, it floors me. But here we go. Verse 12. Elohim said toward Abraham, don't let it be bad in your eyes because of the lad and because of your house servant. All that Sarah says toward you, hearken with her voice, for in Isaac seed will be named for you. And also, the son of the house servant, for a nation I will place him, because he is your seed. And Abraham shouldered up in the morning, and he took bread and a skin of water, and he gave toward Hagar, placing them on her shoulder, along with one brought forth, and he sent her, and she walked, and she wandered in the desert of Beersheba. He just loads her up with some water and a little bit of bread and sends her off. Don't worry about her, Abraham. Wow. And the water from the skin was finished, and she threw the one brought forth under the shrubs. Get this, she takes Ishmael, puts him under a bush, and walks off because she doesn't even want to see him die. Here it goes. She walked and set to herself from before him, making distance about a bowshot, for she said, let me not see at the death of the one brought forth. And she set from before him, and she lifted her voice, and she wept. And Elohim heard the voice of the lad, and the messenger of Elohim called toward Hagar from the skies. And he said to her, what is it to you, Hagar? Don't fear, for Elohim has hearkened toward the voice of the lad where he is there. Arise, lift up the lad, and make strong hold with your hand on him, for I will place him for a large nation. And Elohim opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she walked, and she filled the skin of water, and she made the lad drink. And Elohim was with the lad, and he was large, and he sat in the desert, and he became a shooter, a bowman, and he sat in the desert of Paran, and his mother took a woman for him from the land of Egypt. Now, this particular story, I'm going to continue reading in just a moment, but this is basically all we hear about Ishmael, other than genealogies and the fact that he joins with Isaac to bury their father later. But this is it. We see that the Malach saved him. We see that he grows and he becomes a nation, basically, as it was prophesied. But he's not trouble, at least in terms of by name, right? So we'll talk more. Verse 22, and it was at that time that Avimelech spoke, also Phicol, chief of his company, toward Abraham, saying, Elohim is with you in all that you are doing, and now swear to me here by Elohim that you will not lie to me, or have done with you, you will do the same with me, and with the land whereon you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I swear. And Abraham made Avimelech to be judged over the matters of the well of water that the servants of Avimelech had torn off. And Avimelech said, I do not know who did this thing, and moreover, you didn't tell me, and moreover, I did not hear except today. In other words, he's saying, I don't know anything about this situation. Well, this is the first I've heard about it, and I want to make it right. Verse 27. And Abraham took flock and herd and gave to Avimelech, and two of them cut a pact. And Abraham positioned 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves, and Abimelech said to Abraham, hey, what are they, these 7 ewe lambs that you have positioned by themselves? And he said, because you will take the 7 ewe lambs from my hand in order that you will become a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore he called that place Beersheba. All right, now if you look at the footnote, it's going to tell you that footnote 21, the well of an oath, or well of 7, Beersheba, combined, the well of a 7-fold oath maybe. All right, so it says, therefore he called that place Beersheba, for there the 2 of them swore an oath, and they cut a pact in Beersheba, and Abimelech rose, also Phicol, chief of his troop, and they returned toward the land of the Philistines. And he planted a tamarisk in Beersheba, and he called there in the name of Jehovah, El Age Lasting. And Abraham journeyed in the land of the Philistines abundant days. This reading contains 2 stories. One story deals with the long-awaited birth of the promised seed. We've been hearing since he left Haran this idea of a seed that would be promised, that would bring about great blessing and so forth, and we're just now getting there. It's 25 years. 25 years later. We live in a society and a culture where we want things right now. Microwave. We want fast food. We want everything immediate. We want it brief, quick, fast, and in a hurry. And cheap, too, if you can do that. But in the biblical days, I think we lose sight of the fact that some of these stories extend many, many times. You know, I love studying prophecy, and when I study the book of Daniel, you know, it's like he tells Daniel, just shut it. This is for many days. You're going to go to sleep. Right? Can you imagine somebody today hearing that? This doesn't even have to do with your lifetime, Lyndon. It's going to be, you know, 50 generations from now, and you're going to be like, what? See, the idea is that we have to understand that I think we think that God's talking to Abraham every day. You know, and we long for that kind of relationship, but that's not what's being described here. All right, so the long-awaited birth of the promised seed through whom the covenant would pass. This is, by the way, the story of today, the first story, but it involves another side of the same story. It's also about the exile of Abraham's firstborn. And here's what I think about. There can only be one. That's the idea we get in the story. I'm reminded of another story where Ishmael must decrease, Isaac must increase. You know where I'm coming from. It's the idea that it doesn't mean that God's not taking care of Ishmael. It doesn't mean that God tells Abraham, just throw him out and it's, you know, don't worry about it. It's if he dies, he dies. No, he's got a purpose. He's got a plan for Ishmael's life, but he's got something else in mind for Isaac. And it's through Isaac that Abraham's seed will be known and named, and it's through Isaac that the covenant will pass. But remember, the covenant is universal in implication. So this is a point I hope to tie together towards the close. After today's reading, as I pointed out, Ishmael is only listed in the genealogical list in chapter 25, and then briefly in chapter 25 when they come together to marry their dad. Now there is a story also, a second story, about a covenant. A covenant, I'm not talking about covenant like between God and man covenant. I'm talking about an agreement, a pact, a covenant between Abimelech and Abraham. And I think it's important that this chapter contains the mention of a covenant because in my estimation, what I'm going to cover towards the end of the class is a mixing of these different elements, and I think a misunderstanding or an interpretation which has led to misunderstanding based on this. So part 2 is about the covenant between Abraham and Abimelech. Now, the birth is seemingly a joyous occasion. The birth of the promised seed. Can you imagine singing and dancing in the tent? And I know it doesn't say that, but I can imagine. They're happy. They're excited. The long-awaited seed is here. True to our promise, the record indicates that she brought forth Isaac. He circumcised, and all of this a mere 25 years after the initial word. 25 years. So if you look at I want to go back to chapter 21 and just pick up 2 verses. This is what Sarah says after she gives birth. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. You know, everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would suckle children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age? She's thrilled. You know, she's been the barren one all her life. The first time we meet Sarah, we recognize one thing about her. Not only is she beautiful, but she can't have children. We're told almost immediately that she can't. So all her life, think about this, she's lived with this. It's been something that just goes with her at every stage. And now, in the dawn of her life, not the dawn, the setting of her life, she brings forth a child. So she's happy. Now, I'll also tie this in later, but Isaiah 54, according to the ancient reading cycles, we have a list of the prophet readings that go with these ancient triennial cycle readings. And you know how Isaiah 54:1 begins, where it talks about the one who has been barren will bring forth? It's a beautiful passage about the miraculous birth of Israel, if you will. That's associated with the story in antiquity with Hagar and with Sarah. So keep that in mind because that also ties into our story in a little while. All right. So tension in the home begins to build because Hagar's back and Ishmael's there. And what we read in our story is that Ishmael, though he's not mentioned in our story today, Ishmael is not mentioned, but we know who they're talking about, right? Now, you know how he's mentioned or how he's implicated or how he's alluded to in the story? The son of Hagar the Egyptian. The writer tells us that Sarah sees the son of Hagar the Egyptian. That's Ishmael, right? And it says he's mocking. Now, in the Hebrew, it doesn't say he's mocking Isaac. Now, some translations put that he's mocking Isaac, but the Hebrew doesn't say that in verse 9. What is your translation? Just look at verse 9. We'll see. Just do a little test. If verse 9 says that he's mocking Isaac, does it? Yeah. Yours doesn't. Good. What translation is that? New King James. Good for the New King James.
Yeah, mine says making fun about her son, Isaac.
Uh-huh. So we can assume maybe that he's making fun of Isaac, but we don't know that. He's mocking. You know how big brothers are. So her reaction in verse 10 is pretty stark. Look what she says. She said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman. I want you to get the impact of this. She doesn't say, honey, Hagar's got to go. She doesn't even call her by name. Get this slave woman out of here. Now, I know a lot of people who don't like it when I do this because we know who the Bible picks, so we have to side with, so they don't like that. You want to just read it. Don't inflect your voice. Think about it. Get this slave woman out of here. And her son. Not just her, get them both out. Ah, man. So, in Genesis 16, if you remember, Abraham left things to Sarah. honey, just take care of it. Whatever's good in your eyes, do that to her. She doesn't let him do that this time. She makes him do it. He has to load up the water and the bread. He doesn't have any say, it appears. So in verse 12 and 13, you see this idea that he's distraught over this. I mean, he sees it as a very bad thing. I mean, and I would too. I have to be honest with you. Some of these biblical stories, I like approaching the Bible as honestly as I can. Because for so long in my life, I reacted to the Bible the way I felt like I was supposed to in a religious setting. Had to be parochial in my approach. And we have to. There are things that I read now and I go, I just don't like that. I don't like this. Verse 14 says, So Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. This story gets from bad to worse. Next thing we see, they're out of water. It's hot in the desert, isn't it, Dave? And Dave and I worked for a month in the desert, and, it was nice having fresh water. We could go take a break. We could sit down. I can't imagine starting that trip and going over there and having one skin of water. It wouldn't have been a good outcome.
We went to the same place in July. We couldn't hardly stay outside.
Yeah, exactly. So she puts Ishmael under a bush and goes away so she doesn't have to watch him die. And once again, we have intervention on behalf of Hagar from the Malach, the messenger. And then in verse 20 and 21, it says, God was with the lad, and he grew up and lived in the wilderness, became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran. His mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. End of story. I mean, basically, that's the end of the story, as far as Ishmael goes. The story that involves Abraham, his 2 women, and 2 sons, I wanted to bring in a piece of Torah legislation, let's call it, from Deuteronomy 21. I think sometimes these stories are corrected. Later, when I say that, I mean I think that we read things in the lives of the patriarchs that later are covered by Torah instruction that prevents certain things that aren't good from happening again. Okay? So look at verse 15 of Deuteronomy 21. I think this is relevant. It says, if a man has 2 wives, by the way, there's no word for wife in Hebrew. It says women. If he has 2 women. The one loved and the other disliked, and they've borne him children, both the loved and the disliked, and if the firstborn son is hers that is disliked. To me, this sounds like it kind of goes with our story. Kind of, sort of, right? Then on the day when he assigns his possessions as an inheritance to his sons, he may not treat the son of the loved as the firstborn in preference to the son of the disliked, who is the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the disliked, by giving him a double portion of all that is his. And for he is the first issue of his strength, the right of the firstborn is his. So your first son, according to biblical law, is the one who receives a double portion. Even if this son comes from a woman who is not liked as much as another woman. So you have to think about that. Now, does this apply? Some could argue, yeah, no, whatever. I just want to show you the relation between this text and the story that we covered earlier. Because I want you to look at Genesis 25. Now, we're not there yet in our cycle of readings, but this is important to show you how Abraham did it. How many of you, if I did a trivia question and said, give me the names of Abraham's sons. Abraham had sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And that's generally what we think about. But we at least here have 6 more sons listed in chapter 25. Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimram, Yokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Letushim, and Leumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abidah, and Alda'ah. These were the children of Keturah. Now listen to this. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. Everything. Listen. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac, eastward to the east country. This becomes sort of the mode, the way that Abraham operates. When he has other children, he takes the women and the kids and sends them off. And Isaac, he gives everything. Now, whatever you think about that, that's just the story. But what I want to begin to do is begin to tell you that we're now focusing on Isaac. Because whatever we think about when we read these stories, whatever we think about the casting out of Hagar and Ishmael, the other women and children, sending them forth to the east country, all that's irrelevant because the focus now shifts by divine decree or decision based on what we read, it would seem, to Isaac. All eyes are on Isaac. Let's see what happens. Because it's through Isaac that the covenant will pass. Through Isaac, Abraham's descendants will be named. As we proceed in the unfolding narrative, we'll see that Isaac, that it's through his seed that this covenant will be established. This covenant, when we talk about Isaac, we're talking about a covenant that would be established at Sinai. So I want you to think Abraham, Isaac. Now we'll later get to Jacob. We're not there yet. Isaac is tied to Sinai. Would you agree? I mean, it's through Isaac. When we say the covenant will pass through Isaac, you ought to say, when I think Isaac, I think Sinai. Right? It's this covenant given at Sinai that is given to the descendants of Isaac, that it involves the taking of a nation of slaves and bringing them into the land of promise, the land promised to Abraham, and it will be promised to Isaac as well. They are no longer slaves, if you will, to Egypt, but they are born into a covenant which makes them slaves. Not in a bad way, because they become the servant nation. Isaac's seed, covenant at Sinai, makes Isaac's seed a servant nation, and that's a good thing. They become the servant of God. Now, Scripture does clearly and specifically, through the prophet Jeremiah, speak of a new covenant. You know this. Jeremiah 31, beginning in verse 31. It said, "Behold, days are coming, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, though I was a husband to them." Now, he identifies in this covenant some certain things that are important, that go with the covenant. Here's one of them. I will write my Torah on their hearts. So, yes, when I'm talking about the covenant through the descendants of Isaac that tie them to Sinai, and I mentioned that there's a new covenant coming, even that new covenant deals with Torah being written on the heart. All right? So here's the thing. Whenever I think about this, it talks about that it will in some ways not be like the covenant that he gave with the children of Israel. I'm just checking. Are we okay? Okay. The Sinai covenant. It's going to be the Torah that's written on the heart, though you heard my talk last week. There might be a slight change, but we won't go into that today. But this covenant, even the new covenant, is to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, always and at all times, others could become part of the covenants. In Isaiah 56, for instance, Isaiah 56 says, "Let not the stranger feel like he's utterly cut off." You know that in Isaiah 56 it says that if a non-Jew, if a stranger grabs hold of the covenant to keep the Sabbath, you know a lot of people will tell non-Jews you shouldn't try to keep the Sabbath. They'll even tell you to go purposely try to break it because it's not for you. It's not for you? Well, let me see. Let me look at Isaiah 56. I want to just read this part about Isaiah 50, from Isaiah 56. Blessed is the man, chapter 56, verse 1. Thus says Jehovah, keep justice, do righteousness, for soon my salvation will come and my deliverance be revealed. Blessed is the man who does this, the Son of Man who holds it fast and keeps my Sabbath, not profaning it, and keeps his hand from doing evil. You see, the idea is that this group, this particular group, is not Israelite, but they can too be part of the covenant. It goes on in verse 4, the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath hold fast my covenant. Verse 5, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name which shall not be cut off. So the covenants will pass through Isaac, but it's universal in its being open to all nations, right? That's the idea. But when I talk about the covenant, even the new covenant, Jeremiah 31, it's to and through the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and ultimately Jacob. We have to remember that. To sever, if we sever Isaac, the promised child, from the eternal covenants, and I'm getting ready to lead into something, so take a deep breath, and then you're welcome to fire back at me after it's over, but I want people to think about this. To take Isaac out of context with these covenants and to separate him from Sinai, to suggest that these covenants can be thrown out or cast out, to suggest that the covenant at Sinai is earthly and not of heaven and not spiritual, to me, is at the very least confusing and problematic. I would suggest that very strongly. To propose that those who seek to live their lives according to these covenants that God declared eternal, if you suggest that those who seek to live according to these covenants are to be cast out, I see that as problematic. Now, I would also say that that doesn't agree with Scripture. And yet, as I understand things, one of the most difficult things, one of the passages that I think that has created more confusion than any other comes from the book which is called the Magna Charta of Christian Doctrine, the book of Galatians. What happens when people begin to seek from a Christianity background? It happened to me, it happens to most. When we begin to seek to find the truth, one of the most difficult things that we have to do is to work through, how do you filter all this out? How do you make this fit? And Galatians is very difficult. Now, for years, from a Christian perspective, I used Peter, because Peter said, even Paul's hard to understand, and the unlearned wrestle with him to their own destruction. So I would always say, well, it probably fits, and I'm just not smart enough or spiritually attuned enough or what have you. But I think it's worse than that. If I may quote Paul, I would say it like this: have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? He actually says that in Galatians 4. So what I want to do is I want to cover a little bit of this because I want to initiate, if you will, a dialogue about this subject for those who are still very much trying to make sense of all this. So I don't claim that I have it all figured out, but this is my take on it. Here we go. In the 4th chapter of Galatians, Paul suggests that the story in Genesis 21 is an allegory, right? He says that in Galatians 4. And so what he begins to do, and you can go to Galatians 4 and read this, he begins to identify, and he says that these two women, Hagar and Sarah, are two covenants, right? He makes this claim. So when you look at Hagar, that's the old covenant. When you look at Sarah, that's the new covenant. Hagar old, Sarah new. Now, this is what he wants to do. Two covenants. Hagar represents Mount Sinai in Arabia. So let's talk about Hagar according to Paul's allegory. Hagar is an Egyptian. She represents Sinai. She also represents present Jerusalem, by which he means earthly Jerusalem. Like if you go to Israel right now and you go to Jerusalem, that's Hagar, right? It's not, because he's got another heaven he's talking about. This Hagar he's talking about, he says, present Jerusalem is in slavery with her children. All right? Born of the flesh. Hagar is of the flesh. Hagar, that child, is going to persecute the spiritual child. So now let's look at his allegory for the spiritual. Sarah. He sees Sarah representing Jerusalem above. Okay? And Sarah is our mother. He makes that clear because we're not Hagar. See, he's already created this great divide. And we, he says, like Sarah, are children of promise. He wants to make a distinction between these two covenants. This is the main point. Those that are born of the Spirit and those that are born of the flesh. In my mind, one of the greatest disservices to people who are seeking to understand truth and to find out, you know, when you read through the Hebrew Bible, you read all these passages, and then you grew up hearing that it's all done away with, superseded, abrogated, you know, done away with, cast aside. And a lot of it comes from an understanding that we get from Paul. All right? So stay with me on this. Paul continues in chapter 5. By the way, I didn't read it all, but if you begin in chapter 4 of Galatians, verse 24, this is where I got my commentary from. Now, this is an allegory. These women are two covenants, right? And he goes on from there. He's going to continue in the 5th chapter of Galatians in what, in my opinion, has confused untold, probably billions over the centuries. He's going to build upon this idea between freedom and slavery, where Christ in his model represents freedom from slavery to the law. See the word law, Torah. He wants to show the law subjugated us for a while because we were kids, But then when we grew up, we no longer needed a schoolmaster. We're not under that anymore. We're free. And his idea is that freedom comes through, as he puts it, Christ. And then he adds that anyone who seeks to be justified by the Torah, in other words, if you follow the Torah and it says, do these and you'll live, do these and you'll be blessed, do these and you'll have life, do these and you'll be righteous, anything that says that, he says the opposite. He said it brings death, cursing. You see, it's pretty bad in my opinion. And he says that if you seek to live your life and be justified by the Torah, which God says to do, then he says that you've fallen from grace. Now look at Galatians 5, verse 19. Now the works of the flesh are plain: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, selfishness, dissension, party spirit, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and the like. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Well, that's pretty good. I mean, that's right. We shouldn't participate in those. All those things are forbidden according to the Torah. I mean, I think people misunderstand, though. They often associate these things with Torah because of what follows next. Look, verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. Well, that's true. I mean, the law would tell us to be kind. The Torah teaches us to love, to do what's right. So, but the idea, I think a lot of people, when they get this, they run this dichotomy, they run this separateness all the way through, and in their mind at least, they think I've got flesh and spirit. Flesh is law, Sinai, Torah, list goes on. Spirit is none of those things. That's part of the problem, is people can't understand what's going on here, and I think they really mess it up. Here's the deal. The Torah does make it plain that the seed, Isaac, is in fact the chosen seed. That he is the promised seed. If there is analogy to be found in the story in Genesis 21, if there is an allegory, Isaac and his seed are Sinai. You follow what I'm saying? In other words, you can't take Isaac and say he doesn't represent Sinai, because he does. He represents the covenant. It's through that seed that Sinai comes. So if there is an analogy, you certainly don't put Isaac on the other side of Sinai. You put Isaac with Sinai, because that particular branch through Isaac would bear children unto servanthood. Now, Israel, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are to be a servant nation, elected to bring light to the nations. That's their whole purpose. From the time that God begins to speak to Abraham, he gives him this great global mission. And I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who esteem you lightly. And in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. But it's through their servanthood. Isaiah talks about the servant over and over. It's a nation despised, mocked, just like Isaac was mocked. It says a nation despised, mocked, and rejected will one day be vindicated. Indeed, a nation of slaves. Isaac represents the nation of slaves, but slaves that belong to the master Yehovah. In the ancient triennial cycle of readings, the readings that are associated with Hagar and Sarah are tied to Isaiah chapter 54, which, interestingly enough, Paul quotes in Galatians 4. So look at Isaiah 54 with me. I just want to pick up 2 verses quickly. Isaiah 54, verse 1. Sing, O barren one who did not bear, break forth into singing and cry aloud, you who have not been in travail, for the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her that is married, says Jehovah. Paul actually quotes that in Galatians 4, and a lot of people who not studied the ancient triennial cycle have no way of knowing that that is the reading that's tied to Genesis 16, which deals with Hagar. Now look down at verse 17 of 54. No weapon that's fashioned against you shall prosper, and you shall confute every tongue that rises against you in judgment. This is the heritage of the servants of Jehovah, and their vindication is from me, saith Jehovah. So the idea is that freedom from a biblical perspective is not freedom from obeying God's instructions. It's not a free pass. Grace does not indicate that we don't seek to live our lives according to the Torah. We have grace which permits us to live our lives according to the Torah. We should seek in every opportunity to live a life that's pleasing to God, and the things that please Him are the things that we ought to try to do, right? So I wanted to bring this up as a way of maybe getting people to think about Genesis chapter 21. The story, as it's presented to us in our Bibles, is one that should evoke emotion. You know, we think about not only the fact that we should be happy that God, through Sarah, in this miraculous birth, brings forth Isaac, who would ultimately bring forth Jacob and the seed that would be used to spread the glorious light of Torah all over the earth. But we also have to be careful when we delineate between, when we draw this hard line and we make Hagar and Ishmael bad, and we say throw them out, although I know what the text says, but we have to be careful when we use that to make analogies to draw further conclusions, because I think that's what's caused the most confusion in our day. So with that being said, think on these things, and what we're going to do is we're going to gather around and discuss these things in a dialogue. Now, what we think we're going to do is go live again in a few moments. We'll stop the feed. We'll go live again, and you will see this on our Facebook page for the next live stream. So Shabbat Shalom, stay tuned, and we'll go live again in a few moments.